Hello, everyone, and welcome to California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines with our host, Elaine Chukan Brown. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. We continue our Season 1 wrap-up, the Harvest Sessions, a very special series of on-the-ground harvest reports from across the Golden State, featuring key players in California's winemaking and viticulture scene to give our international audience a comprehensive understanding of the 2020 vintage across regions and wine styles. Today, we look at the sparkling wine harvest across California with guests Scott Caraccioli and Michael Cruse. Before we get started, some housekeeping reminders for everyone. During the webinar, note that there are two communication methods available to participants, a chat section and a Q&A section. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. Just be sure to select everyone, all panelists and attendees in the to field, as it can default to panelists only. The Q&A section, this is where we would like you to submit your questions to be answered during the webinar. And we will do our best to address your questions, but for those that are not answered live, we will provide a Q&A summary in the email you'll receive following the program. Now to introduce the panel, I'd like to first introduce our host, Elaine. In addition to writing for her own site, Waka Waka Wine Reviews, she serves as the American specialist for JancesRobinson.com and contributes to a long list of respected publications. She contributed to the award-winning 8th edition of the World Atlas of Wine and the 4th edition of the Oxford Companion to Wine. She was twice named by the International Wine and Spirits Competition and Vinitaly as one of the world's top wine communicators of the year and as one of Wine Business Monthly's 2020 wine industry leaders. And joining Elaine today is Scott Caraccioli. Scott is a fourth-generation Swiss-Italian, born and raised in the heart of Salinas Valley's agricultural industry. Today, he is general manager of Karacholi Cellars in the northern Santa Lucia Highlands. In addition to Karacholi Cellars, Scott has been the president of the Monterey County Vintners and Growers Association for the last 6 years and has held numerous other board positions. He was instrumental in passing conjunctive labeling throughout Monterey County and remains invested in the evolution of the area as a wine region. And Michael Cruse. After becoming disillusioned with scientific research, he moved first into wine labs and then into the cellars in wineries in Napa. In 2008, he co-founded Ultramarine to use sparkling wine to examine the soils and sites of California. And in 2013, he founded Cruse Wine Company. In 2016, he was named the San Francisco Chronicle's Winemaker of the Year, and he continues to be focused on sparkling wines and the refinement of their technique in the new world as a lens to examine terroir. Now, Elaine, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello. It is a big day in the United States, and so I'm really thankful to both of you for being with us, and I am really happy we're focusing on sparkling wine. So thank you to both of you, Scott and Michael, for making time.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
One of the things I love about this episode, and that we did last week as well, and have tried to do in different ways through the season, is, we have kind of two important perspectives in winemaking. I think sometimes people forget how incredibly diverse California is in terms of ways people can approach growing and making wine. So Scott, your family, it's a family business, family winery, family estate, and all estate fruit at this point. You did get started purchasing some fruit in your region, but you're really getting to make decisions now from that perspective of having your own vineyard and your own winery and a multi-generational family business, which is fantastic. And I love that your intro right away, names the number of generations that your family has been farming here in California. And Michael, you are in a position where you have what in some is a sort of urban winery in a way, and you're sourcing fruit, and it's a first generation business. And I think it's really important that we bring those conversations together, because those very different models actually lead to very different needs and very different pressures in a winery. And so it's great. I really appreciate the two of you being willing to kind of share those perspectives. We're going to talk about a lot today because we're talking about different types of sparkling wine at the same time that we're talking about harvest in multiple parts of the state. And one of the things I want to be sure that viewers know is that next week we're going to really talk very directly about the way that fires and smoke do inform some vintages in California, some growing seasons. And so we're going to have a very direct conversation about that next week. This week, we're going to touch on how it affected specific regions a little bit. So just so people know, I know a lot of people have questions in regards to that. So we'll address it more directly next week. So let's just get started. Let's go ahead and start with sparkling wine. I'm really excited about this lineup of 4 wines we have today. And, Michael, you're here in the North Coast. Your winery there is located in Sonoma, but you're working with vineyards in Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, and the foothills. Mm. And so let's just go ahead and look at the first wine, your sparkling Valdiguie.
Great.
So tell us, though, a lot of people, Pét-Nat is a really popular style of sparkling wine right now, but because it's come onto the scene more recently, I think a lot of people are less aware of what is a Pét-Nat, what makes it a Pét-Nat, why is it different from traditional method.
Right. Well, I think that for me, the easiest way to describe it is that a traditional method sparkling wine starts off with a dry base wine. Okay. You then add sugar and you add yeast and you get bubbles, right? So the bubbles are coming from added yeast and added sugar. In a Pét-Nat, it's the same concept, really, that the fermentation occurs in the bottle, but you don't add sugar and you don't add yeast. So it's basically just a continuation of that first fermentation that occurs in bottle. For us, everything else is the same. So we still riddle, we still disgorge, we still do all that other stuff, which we can touch upon if you want. But my main concept with Pét-Nat is to just sort of take sparkling wine and just have with some varieties that tend to be more aromatic or stronger character. I just prefer using Pét-Nat because it's just a little bit more of a pure grape representation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think of it as a more delicate expression of sparkling wine. The wines tend to be just a little bit softer in the mouth, but also the method has a little bit less impact on the fruit expression. And so I love, though, that your point that, if you're because the thing about Pét-Nat right now is a lot of different unusual varieties are being put into sparkling wine because of this method. And so I love that clarification you're making, that Pét-Nat serves aromatic varieties really well because it can actually sort of preserve the aromatics more than traditional method could.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think the thing is that with traditional method, again, a lot of the stuff I'm going to say is just kind of this big sort of hand waviness. So I apologize for that in advance. But with traditional method, I sort of think of it as the aging process, the longer tirage, things like that. You want that as sort of an impactful aspect of the wine, and maybe you reveal terroir through that longer aging. With Pét-Nat, the grapiness is the important part, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? And that if you can accentuate the grapiness, then you get a pure, better wine, and that's sort of how I look at Pét-Nat, I guess.
Right, and so I mean, you'll notice right away the alcohol is relatively low on a wine like this. And so, talk to us a little bit about that. How does it turn out? We end up with a wine that's 9.5% here. Right.
So you can have a normal alcohol Pét-Nat, but because you're relying on that primary fermentation, for me, I want the wines to be dry and I want them to be pure. So I tend to pick lower to give we don't need to get into fermentation kinetics too much, but essentially by having a lower potential alcohol, we give the yeast less work. That's the reality. So if it's sub 10%, sub 11%, there's a greater chance of them finishing and the wine going dry.
Right. So one of the things I love about this, again, we have 2 different methods that we get to talk about today, but also 2 different perspectives on sparkling. And Scott, your focus really is on traditional method, but of course you've had a lot of Pét-Nats. And one of my very favorite things to do through webinars and public conversations is get winemakers to talk about other winemakers' wines. It's something that the public doesn't get to see all that much, but I think there's so much to learn from it. And so Scott, again, your focus, there in the cellar is mainly traditional method. But, you know, like what jumps out to you tasting Michael's Pét-Nat?
I definitely think the preservation of the grapiness is achieved. I mean, right off the nose, you get being cherries and blueberries kind of jumping out at you. And then the same thing happens on the palate. So the younger vintage showing itself as really a fruit component is something that I really enjoy, in like the freshness and the brightness of the fruit throughout this wine. And you have a really great mousse for driving kind of that flavor home on the palate, which makes it really enjoyable in the mouth as well as on the nose.
Well, and also this, like, the clarity that you get on this wine, because you
Right.
do disgorge. You know, the truth is I always open Pét-Nat over the sink because a lot of them are not disgorged. And so they can like really blow open and make a big mess. And but because you disgorge this, it preserves a sense of real fruit clarity and purity too.
Right.
But,
and this is about as high on my high horse as I'm going to get about that. But that really is disappointing to me, right? Like, this is, I think, as a technique, is something that we should probably use more in sparkling. But because we sort of put the disgorging part on the consumer, right? It becomes a lot more problematic, I think, in a lot of ways. It's where I can just charge $5 more and you could just know that it's not going to explode everywhere.
Right.
You know?
But I mean, one of the things I think it's interesting, because I was drinking what we now call Pét-Nat from France before it was known as a thing in the States, which I don't mean as a bragger thing. I just mean that it was, when I found these kinds of wines from France, I was really surprised more people didn't make them, because there's this like delicate beauty and transparency to this method. But then in the States, I think what's happened is we've tended to see it as kind of an easy approach. Oh, it's an easier way of making sparkling wine. Right. But I know one of the things you've talked about is that, no, actually, in your mind, it's just as technical. It's just a different method.
You're right. I think, and in some ways, because the dependability of the yeast is less clear, it actually is very slightly more technical for us. Like, when we start a tirage culture, and again, we don't need to get into super details, but tirage cultures are pretty dependable. Like, I mean, you have to check them, but more or less, if you make a tirage culture in a standard way, you're going to ferment. Like, it's not a big deal. With Pét-Nats, though, you don't know that that's the case. So we spend a lot more time sort of doing the cell counts, the oxygenation, whatever it is, density checks, all that stuff, in a much more systematic way than we would with our traditional method.
Right. Well, so let's go ahead and pull up the big maps, Katie, so we can get across to people where we're talking about, like, because we're going to start talking about, like, where is this vineyard located and how are different parts of California going. So, like, just to take a step to the side for a second. So this, of course, we always start with the California map to help people understand where we're talking about. And you'll notice that Katie's very nicely put a box around where we're going to zoom into next. And it covers both the North Coast and Central Coast. And so you can see here, North Coast, again, as a reminder, Napa, this particular wine comes from Napa. And so Napa is highlighted there. But the North Coast includes Napa County, Sonoma County, Mendocino County, Lake County. And then Central Coast, you can see, really goes from San Francisco Bay all the way down to Santa Barbara County. It's a super long stretch. But notice that Monterey is highlighted there, and we'll zoom in to talk about that with Scott in a little bit. So if we go into the North Coast slide next. So again, we have here, Michael does get fruit from Mendocino County, but mainly is working with Sonoma County and some Napa Valley. And so we've highlighted those here. So let's go ahead and talk about a little bit about the reality of winemaking in these two areas, or this large area North Coast this year. So this Valdiguie, Valdiguie is a red wine grape, and you've made sparkling Pét-Nat from a red wine for this particular example, and it's 2018 vintage. Right. 2020 was a very different year. So let's be honest. Can you make a wine like this, a sparkling Pét-Nat from a red grape in 2020?
Well, in 2020, this vineyard was, just a quick thing about Rancho Chimiles. Rancho Chimiles is one of the one of the original Vallejo land grants. I'm sure we're going to talk about California history a little bit, but basically it's a contiguous property now split between two owners of the same family, but in the 1,500 acre range, something like that, in the eastern side of Napa, and farmed organically. Been in the same family for many years, and planted in '72. Anyway, the 18 was a strong acid vintage. I mean, it was just beautiful for sparkling wine. It would be, again, speaking purely of the North Coast, it would be really hard to make poor sparkling wine in 2018. 2020, in the first sort of lightning complex fires, the fires came right down to the border of...
so these are the August fires for people.
The August fires, that's right.
So for people less aware of the names, yeah. So in August we had fire,
And this burned from, you can't really see Lake Berryessa on that map, but basically from the entire eastern side of Napa County was burned all the way into Sassoon, essentially. So we, basically that little kind of mushroom heady sort of spiky thing there, kind of all the way down to the bottom part of the blue. Yep. All the way down there was essentially burned. And so we did make sparkling wine from this, but it was direct to press. We didn't have any skin contact at all. Some of, again, I don't know how technical you want to be, but basically a lot of the smoke compounds sort of stay in the skins. So I think Scott and I probably will talk a lot about getting things off of skins and not using skins. So to have a rosé, even a rosé, I would say, for this particular wine, because of the proximity, not speaking about rosés generally, was kind of impossible. So this is, in 2020, it is a very white, very clear, it's still a Pét-Nat, but it was a much different wine.
Well, and so I want to really emphasize what you just said, because I think that there's, the truth is we're still learning a lot of things about how smoke interacts with grapes. But what we do know is that the smoke compounds kind of bind into the skins and don't really go into the fruit, the juice in the middle. And so, like you're saying, it's possible in some places in some years to press off immediately and make a white wine from a red grape. And so, Scott, I know that's something that you and I talked about you doing there in Monterey County as well. So talk to us about that. Like 2020, one of the things you said to me was you're not making any red wines this year, but you were able to make, in your case, were able to make a little bit of rosé. So how did you approach that this year for 2020?
Yeah, I think Michael's point in terms of direct press as a process is the most valid thing that will determine your ability to pick up smoke taint in the wine. And if you ferment on skins like you do in red wine, you're going to extract that contamination into the wine. Where if you know that you're running at some level of having the contaminant in this grape, the guaiacol, then you're able to make decisions through process and in the cellar that will limit your chance of adding that to the wine that you're making. And number one is direct to press, and making rosé in Monterey County this year, specifically Santa Lucia Highlands, specifically my vineyard, which is a skull, was something that we had to look at. We did a lot of test lots and saw exactly where everything was coming in, and ultimately making the decision to only make direct press wines in this year was quintessential to maintaining Karacholi's line of quality and our standards.
Right. I mean, I think that's something that's really important to highlight too. And I know I talked to both of you said this, but a lot of producers I've been speaking to, that's the big thing. The cost of releasing a smoky wine would be complete loss of public trust and reputation. And it is so hard to build like those relationships and those connections over time that the cost of that is far, far greater than the loss of not being able to sell wine. Do either of you want to comment on that?
I mean, I think that's the, I'm a small producer, and this is my main livelihood and everything else. So for me, I think that I have I don't want to say a one-on-one connection with all my customers, but certainly people can trust me and talk to me and ask me about things. And I think the thing that I would say is that, like, for me, nobody's more concerned about smoke taint than I am in terms of my wines, right? And the amount of time that we've spent and the amount of money we've spent and the sort of research that we've done and everything else, it's a really complicated situation. And I don't think there's any real answers for a lot of it, except to say that you guys have my word that I'm not going to put out something that I don't think is worth drinking. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's really the key. And almost everybody feels that way, do you know?
Well, and Scott, you were doing a lot of head-nod agreements on that.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to trusting your producer, trusting your grower, and making sure that, you know, you have that allegiance to what they're going to put out. I have no interest in putting out anything that I know is not the best that I can do. And if that means I don't make a wine in a vintage, like not making red wine, I don't make that wine. And it's ultimately something that really is driven by your values as a winery, and you only get one name.
Right.
Yeah.
And if I can say another thing, Elaine, I think
that
most of the distributors that I work with, and I think Scott would probably second this, is like most of them are going to spend the time to taste through the wines with me and to like learn about what I am producing or not producing, to be a good rep. I mean, because obviously I can't be all over the world either in that. So, you know, we have partners to sort of help explain these stories if we're not talking about, you know, direct to consumer and things like that. And I think that if for the distributors that are listening now, I'm not advising anything, do whatever you want with your businesses, but I think it's worthwhile taking that extra time, if you hadn't already thought to do that, to like actually have some FaceTime with people, taste through the wines, go through it, and try to get the reasoning. Because I think, you know, I don't know about you, Scott, but in 2008, when I was a very young winemaker at that time, but it was a much more of a gotcha kind of situation.
With the fire, you're saying, because
with
for
the fires,
people that don't know that history, there were fires here in California in 2008 as well. Mainly Mendocino was one of the big areas that was hit. Yeah.
Right. But Mendocino and Napa as well, actually, if you start coming down Anderson Valley, things like that. And anyway, in that situation, I do feel like the producers didn't do a good job of sort of explaining what they were trying to do. And I don't think distributors did a good job of explaining what the producers were trying to do. So what ended up happening is that consumers and wine buyers generally sort of started rejecting 2008 kind of out of hand. And not without some justification, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that we know a lot more in 2020. This is the 4th year of fires in the last 5 years. Do you know what I mean? And I think we have a better sense of what to do or not to do. And I think talking to people can go a long way. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, and Scott, I mean, that's something, you know, I've heard you talk about a lot as well, just that idea that anytime there's a shift in weather, you know, you learn more about how to help the vines through that shift in weather. But the vines learn how to adjust too, and that's part of why, like, we value older vines. But one of the things you and I talked about, you know, too, is California at different points has had drought, and you've been, you know, this, you know, let's shift to starting to talk about your Brut Rosé. You know, one of the comments you made is if we're going to compare, you know, your 2014 vintage to 2020, the idea of concentration and drought and improving farming over time, those things all start to come into play. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of idiosyncrasies that go along the way that really lead to the way a vintage expresses itself. And from 14 to 20, I bumped pick point a little bit, from starting around 18, finishing around 19, to really wanting everything to come in at 19. And that's just an evolutional change for Karacholi Cellars, and us realizing what we were getting on a chemistry standpoint and how that was best displayed in the cohesiveness of the cuvee and ultimately the enjoyability of the wines. And in 14, we were, a couple years into the drought. And at the same time, I was starting to take the vineyard more towards dry farming. I started cutting off irrigation, and in 14, 15, 16 was actually the last time I watered other than the heat event right before the fires this year. Mm-hmm. So maintaining as much of that concentration and the varietal character as well as the site character through managing it in the vineyard has been really important. And the 14s, both in the Brut Cuvee and the Brut Rosé, are really wines where we were 50% estate. The year before we were 30% estate. The year before that we were 0. So this was, and the year after, meaning it was just a slow scale of us controlling the whole process from beginning to end and having that next level of ability to make sure that things came in at the right chem. And we kind of, the evolution of the vineyard, things change and you dance with what you have in front of you.
Well, and I appreciate too your honesty about, dry farming is a kind of ideal, but the truth is your focus is on the health of the vineyard. So in a year like 2020, where we did have a heat spike in August, you realized, oh, I haven't watered in 2 years, but actually this would be a time to do it just to help the vines a little bit.
And I think it's something that really comes down to you being in the vineyard and you seeing what the vines are telling you, looking at the tendrils, seeing exactly what the leaves are doing. Are they starting to shrivel? All the things that are giving you the precursors of it needing water. And we had a heat event in 2017, right around Labor Day, and they weren't doing any of those things. Right. And this year they were doing it really, a week before the heat event when it was starting to warm up. In the northern part of Santa Lucia Highlands where we're located, it's pretty cool. And if it's over 90 for a few days, it's relatively warm. And if it gets to 100, 105, it's really warm. And they were wearing it. So I'm not going to have them go through something that they don't necessarily have to when we've been able to build the root system over the last years. I know they can pull from the shed below us, but it's something that they weren't able to get what they needed. So in that situation, I have a great well, I have great water. There's no reason not to put it on and make them endure just for the sake of saying you have.
Right. Well, let's pull up the map, Katie, for the Monterey area, just so people know what we're looking at. And also because there's some, part of why, my understanding is part of why your family selected this area for making a sparkling wine house is because it is so perfectly suited in all sorts of ways. So you can see here this, big Central Coast region that Katie has outlined in the map. And then you can see Monterey AVA is the large yellow area, but within that is the smaller Santa Lucia Highlands AVA. And Santa Lucia Highlands really sits on benchlands against the mountains there. You can kind of through the words see there's the green mountain ridges there. Santa Lucia Highlands is the benchland soils really hugged against the mountains. But the really important thing to note here is that Monterey Bay right off the coast actually has, that's actually a profoundly deep cavern under the water there. And the reason that matters is because, as I say, almost every single week, one of the coldest ocean currents in the world is off the coast of California. And that cold ocean current sort of pools into that deep cavern off the coast of Monterey Bay and really kind of hugs in and stays there, maintaining quite a cool weather system in that region. So you'll notice that the Monterey AVA, the northernmost part of it, really opens fully into the bay itself. And so again, as I was just describing, there's a profoundly cold weather system that really hugs the shoreline of Monterey Bay. And what that means is that Monterey AVA is fully exposed to that cold weather system. And so the way that this AVA works, it's a long, narrow valley with the cold ocean weather at one end. And as the temperatures heat up in the southern end, it sucks the cold weather system from the ocean in the northern part down through the length of the valley. The effect of that is that the further north you are in Monterey AVA, the cooler your growing conditions are. And Scott, my understanding is that your family's vineyard is very far north in the Santa Lucia Highlands AVA, which, as you can see, is pretty far north in the Monterey AVA. So pretty close to that cold weather system.
That's correct. We're 1 block south of Talbot Sleepy Hollow South. We share a fence line. So it's probably the top quarter of that little pink sliver that you see. And really, the wind influence that's created is what keeps us cool too in the diurnals, in that it's much cooler at night than the day. And it creates that suction down to the bottom of Monterey, kind of spreading that cool weather throughout the valley.
Right. Well, and so what we know too is like, we know that winds over 8 miles an hour reduce respiration in the vine, and that helps preserve higher natural acidity levels. But then also the cooler nights can often have that kind of effect as well. And so that's part of why your family felt that that area would be so great for sparkling, because the acidity levels are naturally higher.
Correct.
So well, and so
the
like,
maintaining of acidity is the most important thing. And we don't put any of our base wines through mallow. So really kind of wanting to lean into the acidity and our sense of place in terms of Santa Lucia Highlands, bright fruit. You have California sunshine. We get a lot of phenolic ripeness with our brix levels, but ultimately we have really great structure that allows us to age 4 years on lees and create a sparkling wine that we feel is representative of place as well as vintage.
Right. Well, so let's look at your sparkling rosé from 2014. Just like I asked Scott to talk about Pét-Nat, Michael, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Caraccioli Brut Rosé.
Yeah, I mean, I really like this wine. It's very classic in a lot of ways. And I think that, when I think about sparkling wine and the structure of sparkling wine, very often we sort of lean on the mousse, and the mousse is sort of what creates the kind of character. But I would also argue that acid in its own way can create structure in sparkling, right? Like there can be a block, it can be kind of monolithic acid. It could be more sort of feel it all over kind of acid. And in this, I really like the purity of the acidity and how that sort of creates kind of a clean minerality in the wine. I really like it. It's very, while still being rich too, which is kind of fun. I enjoy it.
Yeah, I think of this wine as having this like bright, highlight spine of acid, like just like pure light. But in a way that it's kind of brilliant because there's no aggressiveness to the acid. Sometimes acid can be really, really sharp. But Scott, you've done a really nice job at kind of maintaining this like really bright, pure line of acidity, and yet, kind of softening the edges so that we can light up, without being burned, so to speak. Because it does really have that richness. But I'm wondering too, if you could comment briefly just on, your wines always strike me as a great example of sparkling that should be aged. It has that structure, like Michael was saying, that would serve aging so well. So how do you see the character evolve with your sparkling wine through aging?
So definitely, having that structural capacity from a chemistry standpoint to age out, and then being on the lees for 4 years, the more time that they are on the cork, the more you kind of get that yeasty characteristic throughout, and you start to pick that up. In the rosé standpoint, it starts to go a little bit more savory as it gets older. The next wine that we have in the Brut, it really starts to become more French bakery, walking in and brioche bun and all the things that we associate with really, yeasty autolytic characteristics, and making sure that those are integrated with the fruit as well as the acid structure, and trying to keep it linear throughout the palate, but not have it something that's dominant, but kind of carries the fruit throughout, is really important.
Right. Well, and so let's go ahead and go right into talking about the Brut Cuvee as well. Scott, like my understanding is the base wine for the Brut Rosé and the Brut Cuvée are the same, but you've added a little bit of red wine to make the rosé. Is that right?
Correct. So the Brut Cuvee and the Brut Rosé are 98.5% the same wine, in that through primary fermentation, and ultimately we bottle the Brut, add the sugar to start secondary, and then we will take the tank of what's left to be made into rosé, and we will add a couple barrels of still red wine, Pinot Noir vinified as red wine, back to the base cuvee to get us to rosé, and really make it more of a Pinot Noir driven expression, where the Brut ends up being a little bit more of a Chardonnay driven expression. But the wines in their essence and their base are, 98% the same wine, yet they drink pretty different glass to glass.
Yeah, they drink really differently. So Michael, your thoughts on the Brut Cuvée?
Yeah, I mean, I really like it, and I think that the interesting part that comes to me is the nose reminds me of Santa Lucia Highlands. Like, that's kind of interesting, is where you get a little bit more of that character of place aromatically, which you wouldn't necessarily think of a wine that's been on Garage that long, but you definitely do. The acid's a little bit more aggressive in this case to me, but I think that kind of adds to the character, the sense of place, with that sort of salty kind of mineral that I think most tasters might mistake for chalk, which is sort of funny, but you have that kind of same impression, that kind of salty acid that it's really nice.
Well, I love that. Actually, I often have these at two different times, so I'm excited to have them side by side, because that's exactly the contrast I get, where there's this like wonderfully salty, like you said, almost chalky element,
right,
that makes me think of completely different foods. Whereas the rosé, it feels just a little bit softer, and I don't mean lacking spine in any way. It's just that there's a tiny bit more attention to fruit, I think, on the rosé.
Yeah, I would definitely think that the rosé is fruitier by comparison, and you get a little bit more of the Chardonnay characteristics and the minerality, where the Chardonnay is planted in the vineyard is kind of more of an alluvial fan. So you pick up some of that salinity, some of the minerality, the things that give you more of a savory note than just fruit, which is more transparent in the Brut, even though they're kind of underlying in the rosé. But I think the Pinot characteristic tends to take center stage by comparison, so it's not as noticeable.
So the rosé you made in the classic method for traditional method rosé, and again, that means adding a little bit of red wine, but for people that are unclear, at what point do you add that?
So we'll bring the grapes in, we'll press them, we'll vinify them dry. Once we know what the blend is, we are going to start to bottle the wines with sugar. So it'll start secondary fermentation. We will bottle all of the Brut. And once we've bottled all of the Brut, we'll add red wine back to the base cuvee in the tank. And we'll do trials. We do everything in house, so I can run trials 4 months before of various different barrels at various different addition levels. We'll blind ourselves and see exactly what comes back. And it's usually a very similar answer year to year, but it gives us the opportunity to know exactly where we're going before we get in the car, and showcase the fruit of the Pinot Noir in the red wine method that we feel kind of exemplifies the perception of the way the wine is.
So in a vintage like 2020, where you decided not to make red wine, how is that going to impact your production of sparkling wine and the proportion of Cuvée to Rosé?
So it's not going to impact me very much at all. I have a couple older barrels of Pinot that have been sitting, on neutral stainless drums. I also have some stuff that I pulled in this year at very low levels, at lower brix levels, and vinified as red wine to see exactly what the exposure was. And added at that level, it's minuscule. It would never be noticeable at 1.5% if something came in at, to a 2 level of glycol. So I have options. I'll do the same thing I do every year. I'll blend some of the wines that I have around, the red wines that I have around, into the Cuvee, and do some of the current vintage stuff and see exactly what the best expression is and go from there.
Okay, cool. So one of the things that's interesting to talk to both of you about is just the idea of dosage. And, so because we're about to move into talking about Cruse tradition, which is, again, a traditional method or a champenoise method, depending on, what terminology you want to use, of sparkling wine. But the two of you, in these wines at least, have made very different choices about dosage levels. But Scott, I know that you also, like you said, because everything's being done in-house, you have the ability to do a lot of in-house trials. And you have actually made wines with relatively low dosage. And what you've expressed to me is that it's very vintage dependent. It's very vineyard dependent. Like it's very much about context. So could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to no dosage wines, it's really your ability to evaluate the base wine that you have and where it comes in from a chemistry perspective, and also the expression that you're trying to achieve when you would like those wines consumed. All of the things that really dictate production of putting something through secondary fermentation. In our wines, as we noticed early on, we had a little bit more dosage to balance the malic acidity that we have. We don't put anything through mallow. And as time went on, we bumped pick points as we became more familiar with our vineyard and blocks, and we're able to probably lower dosage. 15, I've done dosage already, and that's a little bit lower from the trials. And that was probably one of the first times in the history of Karacholi from 06, but it's a matter of trying not to be dogmatic about what you have in front of you. And if the wine's telling you something else, don't be so rigid that you don't do the right thing for the sake of it. I imagine over time our dosage will come down a little bit just as we hone in vineyard practices matched with cellar practices, and ultimately trying to get the most cohesive, balanced cuvee coming out of primary. So then we have more blending options to go into secondary, can make Blanc de Blanc, Blanc de Noirs, and showcase other, idiosyncratic parcels of the vineyard.
Right. Well, so because something, just to clarify, in case anyone doesn't know, malic acid, so a grape has multiple acid types in it, and tartaric acid is the most predominant, but malic acid is super important in terms of wine character, but it actually reduces in the grape over time. So part of why we say, wind speeds matter is because, again, higher wind speeds slow the respiration of a vine. And that matters because respiration of the vine is what actually reduces malic acid levels in the fruit over time. But Michael, you actually make a very different choice than Scott. As Scott keeps emphasizing, they go ahead and block malic, which means they maintain the malic acid in the grape. Sure. And then that informs what dosage they feel is appropriate. Just to clarify too, though, Scott, part of the thing that you've pointed out is that you've actually realized that you prefer now picking a little bit later, and that also means a little bit less malic, which means a little bit less dosage. Just to clarify that I am speaking rightly about that, right? So again, notice though that all of these are all of these choices are interconnected. Michael, in your in this fourth wine that we're going to talk about today, your tradition, Cruse tradition, you actually choose not to block malic, but then you also are able to do no dosage. So could you talk about that a little bit? Right.
I mean, I think that for me, I make some wine that I block mallow. I make some wine that I add dosage. I don't envision a situation where I go through mallow and I add dosage. So the sort of, you can kind of imagine them as kind of, two little kind of curves kind of meeting in the middle a little bit. I think that one of the things for me in tradition is that my goal was really to sort of represent what I think California can do in terms of sparkling wine, and to do that somewhat apart from a sort of Champenoise model on some level. And by that I just mean that what if we valued the site and the sunshine slightly more than we valued acidity, just for a second, just as a thought experiment kind of. And a lot of the grower champagnes that I think I was super interested in and I really like, a lot of them have much lower acid than you would think, kind of. So this wine doesn't, to my palate anyway, doesn't taste low in acid, but yet it's fully through mallow. It doesn't have dosage. The pH is relatively high compared to something like, just speaking about my own wines, like Ultramarine Blanc de Blanc or something like that. And I think that that's part of the interest of the wine rather than that being a detriment to it.
Well, I love this lineup because I mean, I genuinely appreciate all four of these wines. I would happily drink any of these four of these wines. And to be honest, today is going to be a very long day, so I'll probably go ahead and enjoy them in various ways throughout the day. But that said, the Cruse tradition and the Caraccioli wines, the style is distinctly different. And what occurs to me right now is that on the Caraccioli wines, there's this like very clear, bright line of acidity, which is why I keep calling it the spine, or it's like this neon tube of acidity. It's bright, it's clear, it's linear, there's a direction. With the Cruse tradition, there's a way in which the wine is bright. It lifts up my soft palate, like it opens and lights up my whole mouth, but it really kind of like spreads and opens through the whole mouth. Like there's not a single location for it. Right. And so it's just like where this is actually when I do in-person tastings with people, asking them to, instead of just saying, oh, it's medium plus acidity, I'm like, okay, cool. Now, how does it feel in the mouth? Like, let's look at where does it hit in the mouth? How does it move? What shape is it? What does it look like? And that's the thing is that these two wines, I think both have admirable relationships to their acidity. And yet the character of the acidity is so very different. So Scott, looking at the Cruse tradition, this again, a no dosage wine, and again, you've done lots of dosage trials, but now here's a wine that is finished and released as no dosage. Like, what stands out to you for it?
I think it's very finished, to your point of like Michael putting something through mallow and then not using dosage. Like, you get a cohesiveness of the Cuvee, you get a really clean, persistent bubble bead throughout, as well as like this tropical fruit lifted character that really kind of drives the palate. And then the acidity's there and it's prevalent, but it's not as much of a spine, to Elaine's point. It's kind of more in the background, and it allows the wine to be well structured without it being as dominant. And I think the overall characteristic of the wine is really representative of like California sunshine. Like you said, you get that throughout, and the brightness and the ripeness of the fruit matched with process.
The other thing that occurs to me, though, is this as a contrast between the two styles is, and Michael, I mean, I have to say we're not directly talking about ultramarine today, but ultramarine has that textural, like there's teeth to it, I think of that wine, but at the same time, it is relatively linear and bright. And the thing that occurs to me with the tradition is you're playing with oxidation here.
Right.
And so one of the differences I know between the two wines, ultramarine is a very intentionally site-specific vineyard expression of sparkling wine. But this tradition is a very intentional state blend, regional expression. So how do those two things, vineyard expression versus regional expression, how does that change the way you approach making a sparkling cuvee?
Well, I mean, there's many ways to answer that question. I think the thing to talk about ultramarine just briefly. I think or maybe I shouldn't talk about ultramarine specifically. I'll say with my wines generally, everything informs everything else, right? And I think that if the only wine I ever made was from Charlie Heinz's vineyard, as in the case of ultramarine, I think I would want to accentuate the acidity from that vineyard specifically, because it's an acid vineyard that also happens to get as ripe as you want it, right? It's kind of the Goldilocks vineyard in that regard, right? You can get it to 25 bricks if you wanted to make Chardonnay at 15% alcohol there, you know? As you move to other sites in California, if you were to try to do the same thing, to have acid and ripeness, things become overly fruity, if that makes sense. And that's where the oxidation starts taking effect, is that by sort of moving into, rather than fully reductive, moving a little bit into oxidation, you can sort of tone down some of the fruit notes and sort of emphasize some of the more mineral notes. And I think you sort of see that in this wine. I grant you there certainly are tropical characters to it. I'm not saying that there aren't. But if you sort of take that core of acid flavors, maybe, that to me speaks more of sight than it does of anything else.
Well, and so Scott, I mean, you know, it's a little harder maybe to get at this because when you were sourcing fruit, and you know, as you said, with the 14s, they're kind of half purchased fruit and estate fruit. But that said, you still were only sourcing within your little AVA of Santa Lucia Highlands. But so having said that, were there ways that you realized you had to do things differently in the cellar once you shifted to estate fruit versus sourcing fruit? Did you see changes in techniques that were best?
Yeah, and it was something that kind of happened really organically, in terms of, we started, when we went into the vineyard, we really pulled from two blocks, one Pinot block, one Chardonnay block. The vineyard's 124 acres and has about 45 blocks, but those were blocks identified by Michelle in our early history that would be really good representations and allow us to make a seamless transition from purchased fruit to estate fruit. And then as time went on, we started branching out and sourcing from additional blocks. And 2020, we sourced from 3 Pinot blocks and 3 Chardonnay blocks. So in that, we've realized that we can highlight certain clones, certain elevations better with matched cellar techniques. I have some hide clone Chardonnay, some 2A Pinot that was really, from a chemistry standpoint, balanced cohesively. And also independently, but I pulled them together on the same day, did half of it processed individually as Chardonnay, half of it individually processed as Pinot. Hide Chardonnay 2A is Pinot. And then I also put half of it together as a co-fermentation, co-press that would really allow me to have a base cohesiveness that I thought would solidify the structure and the expression of both minerality and kind of fruitiness throughout the profile that tells you what a skull is from a vineyard perspective. And that's just the progression of the vineyard and matching the vineyard to the cellar.
Well, and it's, you know, I spend a lot of time being asked to talk about Pinot in the work that I do, but you know, part of what you're getting at is sparkling wine is actually a context in which maybe the clonal question is actually relevant, because what you're talking about is that there are certain clones of Pinot that do preserve acidity, and I know that's true with Chardonnay too, more readily than others, and that then seeing that clonal makeup in your vineyard versus others you were buying fruit from, that changed your picking decisions.
Correct. And just knowing how those wines preserved acidity through maturation of bricks and sugar accumulation basically made it easier to over time determine what we would harvest this clone at from that block, this clone from that block, and be able to get us to what we felt was the best representation of both our Brut Cuvee and our Brut Rosé, as well as integrating the vineyard into what I hate to say our house style, because part of making vintage wine is you don't have to be as rigid on house style, but from an overall, on being on brand at Karacholi and being structurally true, being able to taste the sunshine, and ultimately being able to taste a skull as the vineyard progresses in its maturation and we transition to being 100% estate.
Can I say something to that, Elaine?
Yeah, please.
Real quickly? I think one of the things that for people watching this that aren't necessarily connected or maybe don't have a full knowledge of California, I think one of the things that, since we're talking about sparkling wine and everything else, we should say that there's not that many people in California that make sparkling wine, for one, or two, one would argue that know how to farm for sparkling either. So we can talk about clones and things like that, and I think that that's fine, and I'm not dismissing that. But talking about yields, talking about watering, talking about ways that people prune and stuff is also incredibly important, because if you look at a vineyard here in Sonoma County that is typically farmed for Chardonnay, generally speaking, that's not going to work for sparkling wine.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, you can't also then go to Écueil or something like that and like look at a vineyard in Champagne and go, oh, well, let's just prune that way, and that's going to work here too. So in a lot of ways, I think what has been my experience over the last 12 years, I guess, has been sort of finding vineyards where the sort of foundational vineyard would work for sparkling, and then working with growers to augment their practices to help that along a little bit, and also seeing what works in different situations. Because I think in some way, my goal from the beginning, and we sort of talked about this, is to use sparkling wine as a lens to terroir generally. But to do that, the grapes have to produce something that have terroir in them to speak of at all, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, like, that's the process where, I mean, this wasn't a question that you asked, but if the question is, where is the future of sort of sparkling wine in California? I don't think it's necessarily chasing sort of these high acid sites all over the place. I think rather it's, can we farm so where the vineyards themselves are starting to speak of this place in bubbles, right? And I think that's the sort of, that's the thing that is sort of the nagging question for me, I guess.
I think that's great, because this goes back to kind of the comment I started with, which is that I love that, we have an estate-focused sparkling wine house, and we have a sourced fruit sparkling wine house, right? Because, like Scott, my understanding is you established your estate vineyard specifically for sparkling wine, but also working with one of California's preeminent sparkling winemakers, to do that. And versus, Michael, you're in a position where you're needing to purchase fruit and you can establish long-term relationships with growers, but that implies the vineyard must already be in place. And so, like you said, it's like, okay, wait, do the bones speak to a potential for sparkling wine? If so, let's start here, and now let's hone the farming towards that.
Right. And does the grower want to mess with me at all in this, right? I mean, that's the other thing too. Like, I don't have any short-term relationships with growers because I'm such a pain in the ass to start with, that if you want to spend that much time with me, you have to actually be curious about it, right? And that's how I got started with Charlie. That's how I got started with Stu. That's how I got started with all these guys.
Well, and Scott, you do farm part of your vineyard for still wine. So one of the questions that's come in, can you briefly, because unfortunately we're almost out of time, but can you briefly comment on what are key differences that farming for sparkling versus farming for still?
I think Michael touched on them a little bit, but pruning, making sure that kind of crop loads are right where we want them to be, as well as watering, which has become less and less important for me just because I don't really water the vineyard in general. So I don't have to worry about pushing it up too close to harvest and giving it a shot to maintain it through, and then that diluting it or affecting bricks and acid prior to you harvesting. I kind of take the line in our vineyard that it sets itself up for really well-positioned sparkling vineyard, but then idiosyncratically over time, making sure that I don't make decisions that will affect still blocks that we have, and kind of manage the vineyard as a whole, and don't do overlapping negative practices that would affect one compared to the other. I map the whole vineyard row for row, so everybody knows exactly what row they're going to take. I sell about 70% of the fruit, so I know exactly what I'm doing in each block for each client, and make sure that they have input into what I'm doing, and I am able to deliver optimal fruit for their program.
Right. Well, and that speaks to part of Michael's point, which is just a grower that's willing to work with you. So just in terms of a couple final questions, Michael, we touched earlier on how Pét-Nats are sometimes disgorged and they're sometimes not. Right. So do you, and I think when they're not disgorged, like you were getting at, it kind of creates a challenge because now the mess goes to the consumer. Do you have, the question that's coming in from Drew is just, do you think it's necessary for New World Pét-Nats to be disgorged to also be accepted?
I think it's necessary. This is a slightly technical response to Drew's question, but I think if you're aiming for sort of high pressure, aiming for champagne pressure, then yes, the answer is yes. If what you want is something more like kind of frizzante at like 2 bar, something like that, maybe not so much. But if I'm going to give you something that's going to be at a champagne level pressure or plus or minus a bit, then yeah, it's got to be disgorged. Otherwise, you're going to lose half the bottle.
Right. So since we are out of time, I want to actually ask each of you to help me end with, what from this year, Scott, let's start with you. You did make white wine. You did make rosé this year. What from this year are you really excited to see? That the wines that you made, what are you really excited to see down the pike, so to speak?
I'm really excited for the sparkling bases. We were pulling them off really kind of as the fire started, and they are really expressive, and the vintage was great. That's maybe the most frustrating thing of 2020 was everything was lining up for it to be an ideal vintage for red wines as well as white wines and sparkling wines all the way across. And being able to kind of hone the process on the sparkling wine and see a few things that we came out of 19 and wanted to improve upon or really just dial in, and getting to do those was exciting, where some of the things that we wanted to do on red wine, just obviously those will have to wait till 2021. Right.
Well, and so Michael?
So for me, it's two things really. The first is, I think Rancho Chimiles, that vineyard was decimated by smoke. All of the cab is not going to be harvested. All of the Sauvignon Blanc isn't going to be harvested. For us to make a Pét-Nat from that vineyard and pay the grower and then kind of continue, a modicum of money, but something nonetheless, that's a big deal. And then the other thing, kind of to what Scott's saying, I think actually it was a pretty good year for sparkling in Northern California. And I think we have we didn't talk about Sanya Roses, but we did some Sanya Roses that I think actually are really interesting that I'm really excited to see how they develop.
Right. No, thank you. That's the thing is, I was keeping up with harvest, admittedly mainly by phone, but the fruit quality going into August was really high across the state. Right. That's something for people to know. The fruit quality across the state was really high. People were really excited about getting ready to harvest 2020. And the reason I bring that up and emphasize that is just to say, some of these wines are going to turn out to be really golden, like really great. It's just like Scott, like you said, know your producer, and like Michael, you were getting at, trust their reputation. Like people are there. The producer is the one most invested in how the wines turned out. And so if you know your producer and trust them, we're going to find some good wines because they're going to make the choices to ensure that. I want to thank both of you for sending me sparkling wine. This is the first episode I did not spit. Not as any sort of commentary on the quality of wines in prior episodes. It's just sparkling wine is good. And today's a big day in the United States. So again, thank you to both of you for making time to be with us today. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. We do have another harvest episode next week, which will be, again, focusing on what California has learned from research on various climate change issues, and specifically on 2020. And then we have a fantastic finale episode bringing together lots of producers from around the state. So again, thank you to everybody who tuned in today. And thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Michael. A recording of today's webinar will be published to the California Wine Institute's YouTube channel very soon, and all of you participants will receive an email with the link. So remember also that you can access all of the previous Behind the Wines episodes on that YouTube channel. And as Elaine mentioned, we hope that you'll join us next week as we wrap up the harvest sessions with a look at the North Coast with guests Steve Mathiasen and of Mathiasen Wines and Elizabeth Forrestel of University of California, Davis. So that session will take place on Tuesday, November 10th at 10 a.m. Pacific. So thank you all. Have a great week.
Thanks.